when I was thinking about doing this talk, the question is, what is it that I might add that would be unique to my perspective, right? And first of all, the first thing obviously would be what goes on at the family level. And that's become more in the last 10 years or so, maybe less, more of an area of investigation, because many people who are either in the mental health field and or in the grief and loss field have no background in studying families in the theoretical or research way. So there's a whole lot that comes out of family theory, and that would be, in this case, what we're talking about, the internal family worlds of families where someone in the family has taken their life. So suicide survivor families, if we could think of it that way gently. So what goes on in there? And lots of things go on that are about that family dynamic upon which a death occurs. Cheryl Niebuhr, who's one of our earlier grief contributors in the Twin Cities, she talked about how families have to remember themselves. In other words, when somebody's missing, then the family has to restructure. And she called it re-membering, and it's a wonderful way to think about it, because the whole family structure changes. Somebody's missing, there's a hole in the family. No matter whether it's a healthy family or not, there's a hole in that family. And so how does that play out in terms of the generations, and how do the roles within the family shift? How do the boundaries in the family shift? And how does the energy flow in the family work? Who's leading and who's limping along? Who's hyper performing and who's underperforming, which is kind of how it happens. And those are all family variables that very seldom get talked about. And so when we think preventively about families, there's a lot to be said for looking at how family members are relating to each other. Are the kids still allowed to be kids, or are they getting sucked up into a higher generation where they start acting like their parents? One parent dies, then the other parent has got to carry that family, whatever age, depends on the age, but say it's a dad or a mom that's taken their life. Then the kids are at risk right away for getting drawn up into being parentified. In other words, dad takes his life and mom starts leaning on the oldest kid. And certainly, when we think about Becky's family, that's something that she's been cognizant of and worked really hard not to lean too hard onto her kids, but to lean to her friends, to depend on her friends and to good consultants. And so when I look through the workbook, what I'm looking at is what can we do with those parts of the workbook that will pull in some of the dynamics of the family. And there's a lot in there. Almost every exercise in the book can be thought of that way if you're broad-minded and keep thinking, what's the family level? What's the family level? What's the family level? And that way we can watch for, is somebody in the family getting leaned on more than they should be, given that they're a kid? What if somebody in the family is missing? Who's going to pick up the roles of that person? And that's a critical piece. How does a family make sense of an experience of loss, and particularly a loss by suicide? You can see stages in Becky's kids where there's some anger. There's some anger about dad. How, what did you do that for? Why did you leave us? And you can see that as you read through the books. But if we're watching for the meaning, how does any family think about, how do they interact with each other, trying to make some sense? How could this happen? What went on? Why? What was that all about? What was going on in his head? How could he possibly leave us? All the things that Becky's kids ask about what happened and the things they struggle with. And then they have to start thinking about what will not happen. I mean, I noticed that Patty's thinking about who's going to walk me down the aisle, And that's why I think it's important for anybody working on using these books to read the books first, to get the story. The most important way that we have to make sense of anything is by telling the story. And but what can be done is if you have one person in front of you and you're wanting to work from a family perspective, inside the cover of my files for every single one, I have a genogram so I can glance over there and I can say, oh yeah, that's your cousin Charlie, right? Or that's your grandpa that you're talking about. Got it, got it. And then I can use their names. So even if you've got one person in front of you, you have a genogram of the family or a picture of the family in mind and hopefully in front of you. So one person is there. And if you want to work from a systems point of view, that page has got wonderful comments on it that get at the whole idea, get at the idea of meaning. For instance, one of the things is my role and responsibilities in the family have changed. That's one right up here. And that begins to call our attention to the fact that somebody in the family may be taking way more responsibility than what they used to. I worry about who might die next. And that happens in every family I've ever worked with. Once somebody's died, especially by suicide, who might be the next one? Who might? If we lost one, suddenly it's real. Oh yeah, people in my family can die. It can happen. And then we've got one down here. My parent cries a lot more. What does a kid, what does that mean? If the parent is crying, does that mean they can't cope? Does that mean you have to soothe them? You know, so that even though that's one person speaking, you can think it into the family. You can think it into the family dynamic. I feel invisible, like people don't see me, would be another one. When all the focus is on the death that occurred, however it occurred, then the people in the family can feel as if they're not there, right? So one of the family therapy, I don't want to say tricks, but skills or techniques, is to ask somebody, one person maybe in front of you, how would your father answer that question if I asked him that question? Or how do you think your brother would answer the question I just asked you? How do you think your mom would answer that question? And all of a sudden you start to see the pattern. We need to know, what is your experience, Mom? What's your experience? Tell us, as Becky did in the book that she wrote. She gives a beautiful description of what it was like from her before and during and after. So if you read that, you might not be your same experience, but it's one to bounce off from. And, well, I was more angry than she was, or I felt more lonely than she did. If you have something like that to jump off from, then that brings up everybody else in the family and how they would respond. And that's the power in these books, is just exactly, it's a very detailed story of a given family with a suicide death, a critical member of the family, somebody that had a lot of responsibility for everybody else, takes his life. And so the details, the particulars in that family are what's important. It's important to say, okay, how do they compare to every other family? How many families in our country are going through the same thing? It's all important. But if you're going to intervene, what you want to know is what's going on with this family, with these particular people under these particular circumstances. And that's where therapy is, right in there, right in that. Good therapy is right in that. It's in the details, it's in the specifics of whatever we write. Books and the workbook both are very stimulating. And they're stimulating because there's some critical words, there's descriptions using the various emotions that are attached to the loss of a family member. But even more effectively, I think, is the color. The color is critical here, that it captures various moods. I think that the way in which, in the books, the way in which the artist has used the little dotted lines that flow through the narrative. My experience with anybody who's grieving is they can't take a whole lot of words. Many people, when they're grieving, they can't read a book. They're not going to get a big honking book. They want snippets. Their attention is on thousands of things at the same time. And I think for us as helpers, as therapists, whatever role we're in, helping suicide survivors or survivors from any kind of death, um, we have to be watching. We have to be watching for the ways in which things come through more unconsciously, because the truth is we don't necessarily know, those of us grieving, we don't necessarily know the breadth of our experience. A whole lot of it is subliminal. A whole lot of it is unconscious. A lot of it we haven't really even reached. We haven't really gotten to yet. But when we put our hand to drawing, to making something, and the suggestions in this workbook are really beautiful. They're bound to catch somebody. If you're really big in words, there's lots of room in there for verbal expression. But there also are activities enough so that people who need to have something concrete, something they can touch, something that hits them. You know, I did my how to teach classes at the university. Various teaching theories say the more ways you can introduce to people various types of stimuli, whether they're spatial or auditory or visual, the more likely you are to reach them and to help them have a full expression, full range of expressions, and to connect with whatever ways they might be blocked. And I think many people who have gone through the experience of a sudden death, particularly by suicide, are for many days, if not months and years, somewhat on a survival path. So there's a lot going on in their heads, in their emotional brain, in their hearts, however you want to express it. Lots going on that there are no outlets for, because they're busy. I have to do all the paperwork. I mean, Becky can describe very beautifully how much paperwork that it felt. I think she describes it as endless, the endless paperwork, and that's especially so for a parent who's lost their partner, and then just kids who don't yet have all the vocabulary to say what they feel. One of the pictures is of the teacher's up front, and here's the class. You don't need a photograph of 14 kids. You just need the suggestion, which is what that picture gives. When you get to the adult section, many of us, we overthink things. We get so in our head, in our words, and explaining things and clarifying things, that when you do something with your hands, when you make something, when you go around the house and you gather objects and you put them in a box, which is one of the activities suggested, it forces you to sort out from your environment those things which mean the most. And when we pay attention to every exercise that anybody does using this wonderful workbook, I think watching two things: watching for meanings. How does what they write show the meaning of the death that can be talked about? And then secondly, how does every one of those exercises reveal what's going on in and among the family members that will get missed? This is a critical piece, and I should have said it first. It's my pet belief, and that is we need to conceptualize that loss as the wound, as the wounding. And then that allows us to conceptualize grief as the healing. And if we don't watch out, what we do without really meaning to, and I do it myself, we make grief a disease, a problem. I want to get over my grief. No, I want to lean into my grief. And if every one of us who works in this field, either directly with direct patient care, client care, or we're back up to that in any kind of a way, if we could just keep in mind that the wound, the loss, the death, the loss is the wound, and then we heal that wound. And if we don't get the terms right, we do crazy thinking. We do nonsensical thinking about it. So the loss is the wound and the grief is the healing, the way that we heal. Grief is a good thing. You know, thank God we can do it. it's the only way we can get our feet under us, or we can get back to some semblance of our lives before the loss. And with a little luck and help, we can grow through the experience. Let people tell you how they've grown, and you can frame that as change. But going back to the loss is the wound, and grief is that way that we heal. Makes it follows as night the day that it will be a healthier, much healthier way to work and to think.